Good evening. Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing.
Some names were expected, others were whispered, and then there were a few that history tried to forget. Elvis Presley's funeral was a profound, complex event, publicly mourned by thousands but quietly tense behind Graceland's gates. While famous faces appeared openly, many attendees stayed hidden, unlisted by design. The funeral was more than a farewell. It was about who could say goodbye. Suspicion, secrecy, and mystery surrounded those shadowy visitors, including prominent Hollywood and music figures who dodged the spotlight. Over time, these quiet guests have become ghosts at the gate, their presence slowly emerging from silence. Today, we're peeling back that veil, because some goodbyes were never meant to stay hidden. August 18, 1977, Memphis, Tennessee. The kind of day where the summer air clings to your skin, thick, heavy, still. Outside the gates of Graceland, thousands gathered before the sun had even risen. Fans pressed up against the iron bars, holding flowers, Elvis records, hand-painted signs. Some wept openly, others just stood in stunned silence like the loss hadn't fully landed yet. It felt impossible. How could someone so alive, so electric, be gone? News vans lined the street, reporters jockeyed for angles, cameras flashed, microphones poked through crowds hoping to catch a moment, any soundbite from someone who knew him, someone who had been let inside. But inside Graceland, the world looked completely different. What had once been a palace of rock and roll, a place filled with laughter, music, and flashbulbs, was now draped in something invisible but unshakable. Grief sat in the air like smoke. Every room felt dimmer, every hallway colder. This wasn't the house of a king anymore. It was a tomb made of memories. And at the center of it all stood Vernon Presley. Elvis's father had always been a quiet man, private, tough in his own way. But on that day, he looked completely undone, pale, trembling, and barely able to hold himself upright. Grief had carved its way into his face. He didn't speak much at first, just nodded silently to people as they came in. But when he finally did speak, the room froze. He stood before a crowd of mourners and said, "I want to thank all of you for the cards, the letters, the love you've shown." His voice cracked almost immediately, and he paused, clutching a crumpled handkerchief in one hand, like it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. "It's been hard. So hard," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Those words echoed through the room, not because they were eloquent, but because they were true, raw, honest. A father who had lost his only son, trying to hold himself together in front of a world that was watching but couldn't possibly understand. Next to him, Priscilla stood quietly, calm on the outside, but you could see the exhaustion behind her eyes. She wasn't just mourning a former husband, she was trying to hold space. For her daughter, for Elvis's legacy, for the tidal wave of grief that had knocked them all off their feet. Lisa Marie clung tightly to her mother's hand, just 9 years old, her wide, searching eyes scanning the room, confused by the emotions swirling around her. One moment she looked dazed, the next, heartbreakingly aware. It was too much for a child, too much for anyone, really. And yet, there they were, trapped in the most public version of personal loss. As people moved through the mansion, some hugged, others cried quietly in corners. There were a few who couldn't bring themselves to speak at all. Some clutched photographs. Others just stared at the casket, trying to reconcile the stillness inside it with the legend they had known. But not everyone was seen clearly that day. Later, Vernon would admit something that shocked a lot of people. He said, "I was so lost in my own sorrow, I didn't even recognize some of the people who came. Faces I should have known for years, they just blurred." That's how overwhelming it was. That's how unreal everything felt. Imagine that. You're surrounded by friends, family, people who flew across the country to comfort you. And your grief is so deep, your pain so sharp, that their faces turn into static. There's something deeply human about that. It shows just how devastating that day truly was. Not just for the fans, not just for the country, but for the man who had raised Elvis. The man who watched his son rise, fall, rise again, and then leave far too soon. And in the background of it all, Graceland, the stage, the sanctuary, stood transformed. It didn't shimmer the way it used to. The stained glass windows seemed darker. The halls felt longer. What once echoed with music now echoed with muffled sobs, whispered prayers, and footsteps that didn't seem to know where they were going. It's strange how a place can change overnight, how a mansion filled with gold records and rhinestone jumpsuits can feel like a graveyard. But that's what grief does. It drains the color from the walls. It quiets the noise. It turns the familiar into something haunting. That day, Graceland was no longer Elvis's home. It was his resting place. And as guests continued to arrive, some expected, some surprising, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another celebrity funeral. This was something different, more sacred, more layered, because behind every handshake and hug was a secret, a memory, a pain too deep to put into words. And behind every familiar face, maybe one or two who weren't so familiar at all. Guests who arrived without fanfare, who slipped through the cracks, who stayed in the shadows, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much to make it about themselves. They came not for the cameras, not for the legacy, but for the man. And as Vernon Presley stood at the front of that house, eyes swollen with tears, voice trembling with heartbreak, he had no idea that some of the most powerful, most unexpected people in Elvis's life were there with him. Quiet, respectful, hidden in plain sight, waiting like everyone else for the moment the music would stop. There were some faces at Elvis Presley's funeral that everyone expected to see, but even those familiar names carried emotions deeper than anyone could have imagined. Let's start with Anne Margaret. To the tabloids, she was the co-star with the flirtatious spark. To fans, she was the red-haired bombshell from Viva Las Vegas. But to Elvis, she was something more, a kindred spirit, a connection that lived somewhere between friendship and romance, depending on who you ask. When Anne Margaret arrived at Graceland that day, she didn't speak to the press. She didn't wear the glam or makeup the public was used to. She moved through the house quietly, somber, almost invisible, until she saw Vernon Presley. And in that moment, something broke. She hugged him, long, hard, without words. Two people bound by the same loss, one as a father, the other as someone who had once shared an unspoken part of Elvis's soul. They cried together, and for a few minutes, time just stopped. Later, Vernon would say that hug meant more than anything anyone said to him that day, that it felt like she understood in a way others couldn't. Standing nearby, though hardly seen by many, was Ginger Alden, Elvis's fiancée at the time of his death, the woman who found him in his final moments. Her face was pale, her posture stiff, like someone frozen between shock and disbelief. It was clear she hadn't processed it. Maybe she never would. She stayed close to family but didn't speak or cry in public, appearing almost numb, grieving not just the loss of the man she was to marry, but the trauma of finding him gone. Many at the funeral were unsure how to interact with her, as she was part of Elvis's final chapter, but not fully accepted. Colonel Tom Parker's presence was complex. Some mourners welcomed him, others resented him for pushing Elvis too hard. Parker stood silently at the room's edge, wearing a plain suit, his expression unreadable and heavy with guilt or regret. He made no speech, just stood quietly, burdened by the weight of his decisions. One man who definitely wasn't expected but appeared anyway, quietly and respectfully, was James Brown, the godfather of soul. Brown didn't arrive with an entourage. He didn't try to be seen. He just showed up, head down, suit sharp, sunglasses on, and found his way inside. He and Elvis had shared something few could understand. They weren't close in the way you'd think, but they respected each other deeply. James Brown once said Elvis was the only white artist who truly understood soul, and that meant something. At the funeral, Brown didn't speak much. He found a quiet corner, offered his prayers, and left without fanfare. but those who noticed him said he looked deeply moved, quietly heartbroken. He didn't say goodbye to a rival, one guest recalled. He said goodbye to a brother in music. And then there was George Hamilton, the actor with the golden tan and effortless charm. Elvis and George weren't just acquaintances, they had been friends, the kind who could call each other late at night, the kind who got each other even in the chaos of Hollywood. But at the funeral, Hamilton looked like a different man. Pale, tight-lipped, distracted. Gone was the sparkle. Gone was the smile. He stood still most of the day, barely speaking to anyone, just watching, observing, taking it all in like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Later, he'd admit that he didn't remember much about the day, that it all felt like a slow-motion dream. There was just so much emotion in the air, he said. You couldn't breathe without feeling it. And that's really what connected all these people. Anne Margaret, Ginger, Colonel Parker, James Brown, George Hamilton. They each had a very different relationship with Elvis. Some were deeply personal, others professional. Some were full of love, others complicated history. But every single one of them felt the same hollow punch to the gut that day. The kind of pain that sticks with you, the kind that doesn't just fade with time. They didn't come for publicity. They didn't show up to be part of some celebrity roll call. They came because they had to, because whatever Elvis meant to the world, he meant something different, something personal to each of them. And in that house, surrounded by silence and sorrow, they found their own ways to grieve. Some cried, some prayed, some just stood still. But all of them, everyone, felt the weight of what had been lost. A legend, a friend, a man. Gone too soon, but never truly gone, because some bonds don't end with death. They just take on a different shape. And that day, in the heart of Graceland, you could almost feel those bonds vibrating in the air, soft, invisible, and unbreakable. Some guests walked through the front door. Others slipped in through side entrances. A few didn't show up on any official list. No photos, no headlines, but they were there. Quietly, purposefully, and often unnoticed by everyone except a few watchful eyes. Let's count them down. 5 guests whose presence at Elvis Presley's funeral still sparks whispers to this day. Number 5. Muhammad Ali. There were no photos of him at Graceland, no public statements, but multiple insiders claimed that Ali sent a close representative in his place, someone who stood by the wall, hands folded, eyes lowered. It was a gesture of deep respect. Ali and Elvis weren't everyday friends, but they shared something rare, the burden of global fame. Both men knew what it meant to be idolized, misunderstood, and constantly under pressure. Elvis had even gifted Ali a custom robe years earlier. That moment left an impression, and Ali never forgot it. Some say he would have attended in person if it hadn't been for the crowds, the chaos, and the attention he didn't want to draw. Number 4. Barbra Streisand. She wasn't spotted at the ceremony. Her name wasn't read aloud, but several sources said she reached out privately, sending a handwritten letter or a personal message through someone in Elvis's circle. The connection between Barbra and Elvis had always been a quiet one, mostly rooted in mutual admiration. She had once wanted him for A Star Is Born, believing he could bring something no other actor could. That deal never happened, but the respect remained. Her tribute wasn't public, and maybe that's exactly how she wanted it. Private, personal, and heartfelt. Number 3. Johnny Cash. Now this one's a mystery that's never been fully solved. Some say Johnny Cash showed up unannounced, entered the mansion briefly, paid his respects, and left without saying a word. Others say he wasn't there at all, that it was just a rumor sparked by a glimpse of someone who looked like him. But insiders, including a few staff members at Graceland, insisted he was there, dressed in black naturally, standing at the back of the room, silent, reverent. The truth? We may never know, but it wouldn't be surprising. Elvis and Johnny shared a long history, 2 Southern boys who helped shape rock and country music from the ground up. If he was there, he clearly didn't come to be seen. He came to mourn. Number 2. Linda Thompson, Elvis's longtime girlfriend before Ginger Alden. Linda had been by his side through some of his most difficult years, years of emotional and physical struggle. She knew him in a way very few did. After they parted ways, they remained in touch. And when the end came, Linda didn't try to make it about her. She attended the funeral, yes, but kept to the shadows. No interviews, no headlines, just a quiet figure in the crowd carrying years of love and heartbreak with her. Some attendees said they saw her standing near a window, looking out at the sea of fans beyond the gates. Just standing there, not moving, maybe remembering a better time, maybe trying to say goodbye without falling apart. And number 1, Sammy Davis Jr. Of all the guests who tried to go unnoticed, Sammy Davis Jr.'s appearance might be the most quietly heartbreaking. He arrived alone, no press, no flashes, just a man in mourning. He didn't approach the front, didn't speak to anyone unless spoken to. A few guests later recalled seeing him standing at the very edge of the room, hat in hand, sunglasses still on, his head bowed. When he finally approached the casket, it was slow, hesitant, as if walking toward it made everything too real. He stood there for a few moments, whispering something no one could hear. And then, just like that, he left. He didn't sign a log, didn't linger, but those who noticed said he looked smaller somehow, like grief had taken a piece of him with it. And he wasn't alone. In fact, several people, names we may never know, came and went without fanfare. Some didn't even stay for the full service. They arrived, walked straight to the casket, paused for a breathless moment, and disappeared. Later, a family friend said, "There were people I knew were there, but when I look back through photos and records, nothing. It's like they were ghosts." And maybe that's exactly what they were. People who didn't come to be remembered, but to remember. People who didn't want to be caught in the spotlight of a legend's final goodbye, but needed to say their piece in silence. In a world where fame often demands attention, these guests chose something else: privacy, humility, and quiet grief. And as the years passed, these secret appearances became part of the funeral's myth. A reminder that even the most public of lives can end in a moment filled with secrets, whispers, and the gentle footsteps of those who loved. From a distance. So why all the secrecy? Why did some of the biggest names in music, film, and culture attend Elvis Presley's funeral without ever being publicly acknowledged? The answer is layered and deeply human. For many, it was about privacy, not just their own, but Elvis's. Some relationships were complicated. Not every connection was simple or sweet, and showing up didn't mean reopening old wounds or drawing attention. It meant quietly honoring someone who had shaped a piece of their life, without the glare of headlines. Then there was the media frenzy. The press was everywhere. Fans were crushed up against the gates. Helicopters buzzed overhead. For some celebrities, even being seen at Graceland could have turned into a circus, and none of them wanted that. Not for themselves, and certainly not for Elvis's family. Security was another factor. Elvis's funeral had already drawn thousands. More celebrity sightings would have overwhelmed the scene, made it harder for anyone, famous or not, to grieve in peace. But above all, it came down to respect. These weren't appearances. They weren't red carpets or charity galas. This was a final goodbye. A farewell to someone who had changed lives, changed music, changed everything. And for the ones who came quietly, the message was clear. This wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing him one last time, as a friend, as a legend, as a man who, for all his fame, deserved a moment of dignity, free from flashbulbs and noise. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Who surprised you the most? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of untold history. More powerful stories like this one are just around the corner. Thanks for watching.